Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for coming on this. I don't know, it's feeling a bit wintry now, isn't it, these mornings? My name's Sarah Lethbridge. I'm the Pro Dean for External Engagement here in Cardiff Business School. If you want to chat about all of the ways that you can engage with the business school and indeed the wider university, feel free to just drop me a line and get in touch. And if you haven't signed up to be part of our business school community, there's a handy QR code there for you to get involved. But most of you, I hope, are already part of our business community. So really delighted for the topic today. Thank you so much both for joining us. I'll introduce you more formally after I've done a few bits and bobs and introduced lots of activities that are going on in the school. Really exciting news. At the front, diligently, Dr. Alison Parkin is our new director. Morning, new Director of Executive Education. So please get in contact with Alison if you have any short course needs, if your organisation would like to develop any bespoke continuous professional development, then get in touch and Alison and me can have a good chat with you about what you need. So forthcoming events, we've got a Public Value Engagement Fellowship Conference led by our Pro Dean for Public Value, Professor Peter Wells. And this is a really exciting day, actually, where we're lucky with our public value strategy in the school to afford a bit of time and a bit of resource to enable our academics to actually engage in some really interesting public value research. So that day, it's a drop-in, drop-out day, is an opportunity to find out what they're up to. So please join us. We'd be really happy to have you. Also, a major push for our short course on blockchain fundamentals. The words block and chain smushed together tend to generate a sense of fear in me, but we've got a lot of people in Cardiff Business School who actually know what it means and actually know how it can really help to develop supply chains. So Dr. Shane Jahanshalu is a real expert in this area. So I really recommend looking at that blockchain fundamentals short course, finding out what it's about and registering to get involved. And then we're also lucky, Professor Jane Lynch, Professor of Procurement, specialist in supply chain expertise. She's helping us to facilitate a specific breakfast briefing on all of the amazing exporting opportunities that there are and all the support that's available to help companies to export. So I really recommend, again, looking out for that one, signing up 24th of October. And Harrod, where are you? She's in the back doing all the chats on the Zoom for all of our online participants. She's done a wonderful job with Peter Wells organising a series of public value podcasts. Basically, it's a way to make our research that a little bit more accessible, getting it out there. You can plug in while you're walking the dog. I really recommend it. Lovely episode from Dr. Mariam Lofty talking about the fabulous work that she's doing into modern slavery. So yeah, please listen in, tune in on Spotify, YouTube. Nick is here. Oh, look, he's meeting and greeting people at the back. Hi, Nick. He's organising a series of Indian chapters. They're called chapters, which are alumni events. So if you do know anyone who's interested in joining our Indian chapters, a former alum, then please get in contact with Nick. And he'd love to connect with all of our alumni, find out, what you could benefit from the school. Please get in touch. That'd be great. So now to this event. It is being recorded. Please put any questions through if you're listening online. How many people have we got online, by the way? Oh, 44 so far. Please pop the questions in the chat online or at the end of the session, please raise your hand and and wait for a mic. That is key. Wait for a mic for people at home to be able to hear you. And hopefully we can have a good discussion following your discussion today. So let me now introduce you to, and I've got to be honest, I've had to abridge the introduction because they were very considerable biographies for both of you. Reverend Right Honourable Dr. Rowan Williams was the Bishop of Monmouth, 92 to 2002, Archbishop of Wales, 99 to 2002, before becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury between 2003 and 2012. Since 2014, Chancellor of the University of South Wales, Chair of Christian Aid, and working with Laura as co-chairs on the Independent Commission work. Laura, you were awarded the CPE for Services to Sport in 2016, following a very successful football career. And you were formerly Professor of Governance at Liverpool University, now Professor of Public Policy and the Governance of Wales at the Wales Governance Centre here in Cardiff University. And of course, since April 2023, you've also been Vice President at UEFA, and I understand you've got an engagement that you have to go following this session to help UEFA's work. So together, they're working on looking at this cross-political party endeavour, listening to the huge variety of voices that comprise the people of Wales that make up our wonderful country, to then provoke and inspire what kind of Wales do we want to be? How are we going to help ourselves to fulfil our potential and realise our collective ambition? So really excited to hand over to you and find out about your work, and then hopefully to hear from our audience online and in person with some really intriguing questions. So thank you so much both today, and over to you.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn, Sarah. Bore da bawb. I think I can speak for Rowan in saying it's our pleasure to have another opportunity to talk about the work of the Commission. Technically, we are no more as a Commission. We finished our work in January this year, the product of which was this fairly hefty report, which followed on from an interim report in December 2022. But I would say, first of all, that it was an enormous privilege to work with Rowan. We knew each other, but not well before we started the work. But we know each other very well now, because there's nothing like throwing two people together in the co-chair's role with a cross-party commission containing the former leader of Plaid Cymru and a former Conservative SPAD, and the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats and a former Labour MP, and non-party aligned people, and expect them to come up with a unanimous report. So Rowan and I worked very closely on and off the pitch, as we say in football, to make sure that we reached that end. And I'm delighted to say, and I know this meant a lot to both of us, that we did manage to achieve a unanimous report, because I think everyone who's worked in this space in politics will know that if you don't present, in our case, Welsh Government, with a consensus on what the best way forward is, and we'll come to that in a moment, then you've got very little chance of getting political support. So it was really important for us that we brought people on that journey. And I will say that it's very unusual in this sort of ecosystem to have all four political parties represented on a commission. It wouldn't have happened in Scotland. It would probably not have happened at UK level. And the fact that it did happen in Wales tells us something about the potential we have to develop a different form of democratic dialogue, which was a really important part of our work in the Commission. I think the co-chairs model worked very well, Rowan, didn't it? Because we've got different skills and different backgrounds, and we were able to utilise those, I think, fairly effectively in the course of the work. So perhaps, Rowan, we should say a little bit about what we were tasked to do and how we set about it, and then we can talk more about the report afterwards.
It's a delight to be here and to be able to talk about this work, which, as Laura said, was stretching, exciting, and at the end of the day, I like to think positive. But perhaps it's worth beginning by saying what we were not asked to do. We were not asked to do an end-of-term report on the performance of devolved government, and we were not asked to write a constitution for Wales. There were quite a few people, as Laura will remember, who thought that one or both of those might be our task. But no, the job we were given was to sketch out possible constitutional futures for Wales. That is, futures which built upon, rather than simply unravelling, the existing devolved settlement. Now, to do that effectively, you do have to ask, how is the devolved settlement working? That's rather different from what I call the end-of-term report on performance. Really, we're looking at the coherence of the devolved settlement as it exists, and most particularly, where is the shoe pinching? So one of the first questions that we had to address, I think, was how do we get people to tell us what's working and what's not working? Neither of us approached this task with any kind of fixed agenda. We didn't quite know what we'd come up with. We both have political convictions of different sorts. We both have views about the future of Wales, but it seemed to both of us crystal clear that the task first was to find out what was working and what wasn't working. So that was the first thing, finding out where the pressure points were in the settlement. Because as we would both agree, and as I think the whole commission agreed, the devolved settlement as it exists is just a bit ad hoc. Like the character in the 19th century novel, it just growed. Something began, bits and pieces were bolted on. And one of the things which came into focus quite early on was the question of how we look towards something slightly more coherent for Wales, where somebody won't be in the position of, let's say, going to someone in authority and saying, I'd like to see something done about this, and being told, oh, well, that's a non-devolved matter, or the other way around. We need to have some connection. And so that was one of the things which was very much in our minds. Where isn't it working, and where would it be improved by a more connected, a more coherent approach to devolved government? And the areas where we suggested change might be in order really arose out of that, and very much out of this grassroots consultation exercise. We calculated that in the course of the 2+ years we worked on the commission, we were in contact with something like 15,000 people pretty directly. We organized a number of local events, educational and consciousness-raising events, you might say. We got some expert help in contacting, for example, groups which wouldn't normally be involved in conversations like this, including some very impressive young people. More of that later, perhaps. And then, of course, we took our evidence from people we came to call the usual suspects, the experts, the people with a political investment in this. And I think we can say on the basis of that we built up a fairly strong corpus of written evidence, which is going to be there, it's in the bank for whatever now happens in terms of constitutional reform. So just very briefly, before handing back to Laura on one or two of the details, very briefly, for me, the most important thing, and Laura's heard me say this so many times, for me, the most important thing was putting firmly on the table the question of how we create a more responsive, educated, democratic culture in Wales. Not just how we change the structures, but how we change the culture. How do we move towards a more participatory democratic culture? And our own experience of working through, for example, citizens' panels of one sort or another, the citizens' jury and citizens' assembly model very much in our minds, the experience of that suggested that when you actually get people together and help them to make the connections between the things that are difficult in their own lives and the big picture constitutional questions, people get quite enthused and quite motivated. Something of that happened in the run-up to the Future Generations Act some years ago. And looking back, I can recall a consultation organized by the Learned Society of Wales on democracy in Wales, where that experience in the background of the Future Generations legislation, that experience was highlighted as something we really needed to look at hard and build on. And so that was pretty much in the background of some of what we were thinking. So one of the most, I would say, the most significant of our recommendations was, let's invest in the building of that kind of grassroots democratic culture. Let's think about effective consultative processes that will move things on. Let's think about school curricula, but also about lifelong learning in that context. Let's think about what gives people a sense of ownership of their own country and its processes. Because, unsurprisingly, one of the messages we got was about people feeling detached from the processes of both devolved and non-devolved government. Cardiff is as far away as Westminster for lots of people. Indeed, if you happen to live in Holyhead, it's probably a good deal further, emotional and cultural terms. So that's, for me, the key recommendation. Can we create that kind of participatory culture? Can we invest in that? And I think it's fair to say that the Welsh Government's response to that has been pretty positive. They've wanted to invest in that. They've budgeted for exploratory work in that area, and that seems to me entirely a good thing. And as Laura said, one of the things we can say, in addition to the block of expert written evidence and all that we've learned from the consultative processes we engaged in, we think that there's something about the Welsh political culture which allows a level of creative conversation that maybe isn't to be taken for granted everywhere in the UK, to put it politely. So let's hope we can build on that. The specifics of what future constitutional options might look like, Laura, I think, will say a word about in a moment. But the last thing I want to say really is what we finally kind of settled on was a kind of a package of immediate short-term reforms designed to make the present settlement more robust. In other words, whatever happens in the future, there are some things you need to do now. You know, you might think that it would be quite nice to redo the cellar, but meanwhile, there's quite a lot of water coming through the roof. I speak with feeling on this. Not just an academic question at the moment in our house, but a lot of water coming through this. So what do you need to do? You need to fix the roof. And in this instance, fixing the roof means some of the basics we set out in the report in terms of looking again at the Sewell Convention about the relation between devolved government and Westminster, which is in a bit of a shambles, it has been in the last few years. Looking at the constraints on financial management and the budgeting regime for devolved government, which hasn't really been looked at effectively or creatively for quite a long time. Looking at broadcasting regulation and culture. Looking, and this is something, this is much too big for us in a way, but it's in the background of everything, looking at energy policy and its use and its local management. Devolving aspects of the further devolving, I should say, aspects of the justice and policing system. Something on which we were in the detail not wholly unanimous, agreeing that there was work to be done, but not instantly knowing how it might be done. And also looking again at the devolution of responsibility for rail services and related infrastructure in Wales, because as you may have noticed, transport in Wales is occasionally a bit of a headache. Those were the things we said were recommendations to protect devolution. In other words, if anything like the present system is going to work at all, the roof needs to be fixed. But then we sketched out the 3 possible scenarios for the future. And Laura, I'd like to say a word about that.
So before I talk about those, just to add to Rowan's comments, I mean, I don't think we imagined at the start that we would make 3 of our 10 recommendations around democracy and democratic literacy, for want of a better term, but it became really apparent to us, as Rowan said, that there was an energy amongst the Welsh population to know more about how they're governed. But at the moment, there was a big chasm between what they knew and what was happening and how they related to it. So there's plenty of data in the report and in the supporting evidence around lack of knowledge of what's devolved, a conflation of government with parliament, which is really problematic because that doesn't happen in most democratically literate societies. When things go wrong in Wales, I give you 20 miles per hour. Whether you think that's right or wrong, if the public thinks that's wrong, they blame the Senedd as well as the Welsh Government. And that threatens devolution because people who have other agendas want to then call for abolishing the Senedd because of a government policy. So that issue of a conflation of what the government does with what the Parliament is there for is quite an important one. And of course, all that comes down to knowledge and understanding of the settlement. So 3 of our recommendations are purely around being innovative and imaginative about how we connect people again with politics, because what we call the Q sandwich approach of our methodology, which was qualitative work with citizens panels, then survey work, and then returning to the same panels to ask them if their views had changed. So a kind of qualitative, quantitative, qualitative approach, yes, was really interesting because what it showed from the panels, which were of course weighted and representative, of the Welsh nation, what it showed was there was a real enthusiasm to know more. When people knew more, they changed opinions, and that was really interesting. Not just about constitutional choices, but about how they felt about government and the Senedd. And so all of that gives you a little bit of hope because, the naysayers will say all the time, Rowan and I were handed a hospital pass, national conversation on politics. Well, good luck to you, on that one. And I'm not claiming for a moment that we did everything perfectly or as expansively as we would have liked in 2 years. But we had a good go at it. We had a good go at it. And secondly, what we learned from that showed that there's cause for optimism. There's cause for being positive about this as well. So I think that's why 3 of our recommendations are on that. As Rowan mentioned, the other 7 are on very specific things that need to be done quickly just to strengthen and protect the devolution settlement we have, because it's grown in such an ad hoc way. Interestingly, those are areas which have caused as much controversy as the 3 constitutional options, because what you'll obviously want to know about is the response to the report. And I mean, I've written about this, so it's in the public domain anyway, but I mean, I think we were both disappointed that in the recent UK general election, there wasn't a more mature, sensible conversation about devolution. The kind of dismissal of devolution of justice and policing and rail infrastructure, and obviously the financial consequences of HS2 is problematic. And I've tried to tackle that head on. I've said to politicians, you can't on the one hand claim that your decisions are being based on evidence and analysis of the evidence, and on the other hand, just ignore data and fairly closely argued rationales for doing things that would improve the lives of the people of Wales. But look, we understand politics as well. That's how party politics works, and in a UK general election, that was almost inevitable. But it's disappointing, let's say. The response from Welsh Government, by the way, to the report was very measured, very comprehensive. It's available for you to look at on the Commission's website. But they dealt with each of our recommendations in turn and explained any concerns they had as a government with what we were claiming. For example, rail infrastructure. We know that there are a lot of shared governance issues when it comes to rail services and rail infrastructure, which will always need a UK level to it, as it does, by the way, in mainland Europe. I travel a lot in mainland Europe at the moment, and you can see how governments work together to ensure that border services are delivered effectively. So there's nothing new about this, by the way. We've got to get rid of this kind of exceptionalism about Wales, as if we're the only country in the world with borders. I mean, crikey, that's every country in the world pretty much. So that whole area of our immediate recommendations has generated quite a lot of interest, because calls for devolution of key areas like justice and rail infrastructure. Equally controversial, I suppose, is the analysis we offered of the 3 constitutional options that we felt were viable for Wales in the future. And those were strengthening devolution, so obviously creating conditions to make a stronger settlement, but with the same constitutional relationship between Wales and the UK. Federal perspectives, obviously federalism is operational in big parts of mainland Europe and beyond, of course. But we don't have a culture of federal politics here. So there are obviously issues with that. There are also issues of size, when one potential partner in a federal arrangement is so big, England, versus the other countries which are, really very small in relative terms. And then finally, independence. And understandably, the claim that we made, which was that independence is viable for Wales, attracted probably most publicity. I get that, of course, because it's the most radical constitutional change. But remember, what we were saying was viability, not necessarily attractiveness, or not necessarily political acceptance. All of those things are different to claiming that a constitutional model is viable. But we weren't asked to recommend one model, so off we went, to analyze all 3 of them. And I think we did that fairly uniquely by creating an evaluation framework, which was based on principles, policy, purpose, the whole framework of how you would analyze a constitution. And we were quite robust in that analysis, I think, Rowan. If you read that in the report and in the supporting evidence, you'll see that we say each of those 3 constitutional options brings opportunities for Wales, but they also bring risks. In the case of strengthening devolution, they bring risks that we don't take advantage of structurally reforming our economy and our politics to engender real change. In the case of independence, they bring real risks over things like budget deficit, pensions, borders, currency, whatever, you know. So the point is not that any one of those options is not viable. Each of them is viable. The decision on which should happen at any point in Wales's future has to come down to the people of Wales through the political parties of Wales. And people will either have an appetite for a greater risk model or they won't. And we saw that in Scotland. By the way, the Scottish independence referendum, of which we've just celebrated, I don't know if celebrate is the right word, but we've just marked 10 years, probably marked the peak of citizen engagement with any political moment for our generation. Because, you know, if you look at what lay behind the Scottish independence referendum, you had engagement by people who'd never before been interested in politics. Turnout was huge, of course, but there was a real conversation, you know, a proper conversation, not always positive, you know, at times quite bitter, such is life, but very different to the Brexit referendum here, where, you know, the information flows were much more restricted and the engagement was much more polarized and bitter, if you like, than it was in the Scottish Indie ref.
If I could just add one obvious thing coming out of that, is if you begin by asking, what are the problems that need solving? And if that enters into the evaluative framework, then you've got a better chance, I think, of having an honest discussion. I've said it before and I'll say it again. One of the problems about the Brexit referendum was that nobody was quite sure what the problem was it was meant to solve.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're clear about that, I think you do have a better chance of an honest and constructive vision of the future.
And I suppose we should finish, because I'm conscious you want time for questions and online engagement. We should finish by saying, okay, what's happened since? I've alluded to some of that now. The report came out in January. We had various audiences with Welsh Government cabinet members responsible for this. But of course, let's be fair, Welsh politics has been in a state of turmoil for the past 6 months. So, you know, we've had multiple First Ministers, we've had multiple Cabinet Secretaries dealing with constitutional matters. So it hasn't been a very stable terrain, really, to address these issues. But actually, in fairness to Welsh Government, as I said, the response to the report was excellent, I thought, and very measured and very self-aware and critical. The debate in the Senedd was positive. Clearly, there were party political orchestrated events going on as well, normal. So the Conservatives obviously didn't want to give their unequivocal support to the way we even approached the task we had. I get that as well. But the most important thing to say is that, of course, most of what we put in the report, apart from the democratic recommendations, is in the gift of the UK government, not the Welsh government. So changing SEWL, making SEWL statutory, you know, putting intergovernmental relations, we haven't touched on that at all, which is really important, by the way. Putting IGR on a statutory footing is really extremely important. And whilst that should be a collaborative venture, really it comes down to UK Gov legislating effectively for that. We could talk about that if people are interested. The same with the financial management process. So the lack of flexibility that the Welsh Government has for in-year spend is ridiculous, you know, and you wouldn't run a parish council on that basis, quite frankly. It's ludicrous the way that whole budgetary inflexibility operates. So obviously all of that, never mind the devolution of specific areas, you know, that we've talked about, like potentially Crown Estate, justice, policing, and so on. All of that is in the gift of the UK government. Well, we know we have a new UK government now. All I'll say about that is that we're promised better intergovernmental relations based on the fact that the same party is in power in the two nations. I would not hold my breath on that, if I'm being really honest, because it's about more than culture and it's about more than party politics in reality. It's about parity of esteem. It's about respect. And I've yet to see anything. I hope I'm not being too controversial, but I can say anything I like now, really. I haven't seen anything yet from this UK government that suggests they have a different approach to Wales and the devolved settlement than was there previously. So it's early days. Let's give them some time and let's give them some benefit. But, you know, I would like to see a more balanced, equitable relationship that's based on parity of esteem rather than an idea that one government has far more authority and power than the other. So that's where we are at the moment. We're early days, obviously only 8 months since the publication of the report, and we've had a UK general election and changes in Welsh Government. So I think there's lots to be positive about. But ultimately, it's over to you and the people of Wales about what you want to run with from this, because we finish where we started, really, which is this is about the people, not what we said in our report, really. And where it goes will be based on what appetite there is, I guess, from people now.
What people think will make it work better, basically.
Thank you. First question. We have, oh, brilliant. Go to you, Roger. Thank you. There we go. There we go.
Great. A great outlining of what you've done. But how do you maintain momentum when your roles as co-chairs have now ceased, and two better advocates I can't think of, but how do you carry on that engagement that you so successfully have achieved so far?
Well, there's a sense in which, of course, when you've done a piece of work like this, you let it go. And I think we don't want to be fiddling with the detail. There it is now. But I think the point you make about advocacy is important. And I guess in the last few months, both of us have taken the chances we've had of using the platform this has given us to speak about it. I spoke at the Eisteddfod this year. Laura, you've spoken in a number of contexts about it. So we've tried to keep that going. But from the side of the Welsh Government, I think there's been a real willingness to keep us in the conversation. And I've been grateful for that. There is, basically the Secretariat who worked with us and did stellar work on producing this report. And we couldn't have been better served, I think, by our Secretariat. Wonderful. Basically, that group will continue to have this as their focus. So it's not as if it's just going to sit on the shelf, I think. But it will need us, I think, to be, well, keeping an eye on things, taking the opportunities we're given. We both said we stand ready to, do what we can do in terms of keeping the conversation alive.
And I think we both have different roles in that, because obviously I'm an academic, so I can publish and write and speak publicly about this because it relates to my general academic work. And Rowan has various other important platforms which are reaching audiences that, maybe this debate wouldn't normally reach. So we're both committed to that. And I can remember at the very beginning when we were talking about the scope of our work and how we wanted to operate, because I'd been on various commissions. I mean, if you wanted to slaughter me, which lots of people do on social media, you could say I've been on too many of these commissions. But I've always tried to sort of learn from them and disseminate what we've learned into the next piece of work we do, because I don't think your role finishes the minute that the report is published as a co-chair in this case. I think it's really important to have ownership of what you've said, not to defend it against criticism, because it's easy to criticize, and there's plenty you could criticize in the report, but to make sure that the debate continues, and that there is a wider engagement. And I'm doing a piece of work at the moment with one of the commissioners, Anwen Elias from Aberystwyth University, based on models of democratic engagement and how we theorize and include those more effectively in other areas of public engagement. So, there's academic possibilities, obviously, but there's civic possibilities as well that both of us want to continue. And then there's the work that Welsh Government and the team in the Constitution and Justice Unit are pursuing as well. So hopefully we can keep all that bubbling in what might prove to be a fertile political environment. Who knows how the next year or two will work out.
Thank you. Oh, hand straight up there in the blue shirt. John?
Diolch yn fawr, pawb. So, at the Island Wales International in February, I think it was, I was sitting next to a gentleman, and when the president of Ireland came out to greet the players, this chap turned to me, never met him before, and said, "He's a fantastic president." And when I reflect on Wales and the UK, but certainly in Wales, I never hear anyone saying anything complimentary, let alone praising. And it goes back to the culture that you're referring to. How on earth are we going to crack that nut where politicians, people in government, people in leadership have a degree of respect that people will listen to?
I think it has a lot to do with, as you're implying there, with the sense of ownership of the processes of your own government. Now, I don't know that Ireland has got it all right, but there is that sense that here is somebody who we can accept as representing us credibly. And that's not where we are, is it, as you say? I think there are two elements here, sort of top and bottom. You know, there's building that democratic culture where people are aware of their own dignity, their own freedom in shaping political life. And there's also what we expect of our political leadership, how much genuine trust there is in the political class. It's as low as it's ever been, I suspect. And somewhere looming in the background there is precisely this issue about Wales's own identity. Can that be adequately expressed, symbolized in that way in the UK as presently organized? Does it need independence? Does it need a federal structure? Well, there's a question there, which I hope we can leave on the table, but I'm very conscious of that level of disillusion about political leadership. And when you talk about presidency, because you're not just talking about political leadership in the prime ministerial sense, you're talking about something that symbolizes the country's identity in a way. And what do we do about that? I don't know the answer, frankly. I just sort of sit with it. But maybe not wholly irrelevant for me to mention something that's very much on my mind at the moment, because I've been involved in work around it. Last year was the centenary of the Welsh Women's Peace Petition of 1923-24. Because I'm chair of the Wales Peace Academy, I've had quite a bit to do with helping to oversee that celebration, that commemoration. And this year I found myself speaking several times on this and writing about it in public. And one of the things I've said is that extraordinary event where nearly 500,000 Welsh women, think of it, 500,000 in 1924, that's a big percentage of the overall population, signed a petition to the Congress of the United States of America, asking them to join the League of Nations. And they took it to the States and they gave it to Calvin Coolidge in the White House. Now, I think that's a political culture that's working. It may not have produced the results. I mean, Congress didn't immediately say, oh, right, better do that. But actually, looking at the granular detail, they did make a difference. They galvanized a women's peace movement in North America, who played a very significant role in legislation in the 20s and later on in the 40s when the UN came to existence. But the point is, there is self-confident political culture saying, well, why not? Here we are, corporately owning a vision, not only about peace and war, but also, interestingly, about the drugs trade, about people trafficking, the arms business, 1923. So it can be done, and I think we ought to be proudly celebrating some of that strand in our Welsh political culture. It can be done.
I think we have to avoid getting sucked into the pessimism of politics and say, you know, woe is us, you know, we're doomed. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing that can be done, because I think things can be done. It will take time and it will take a refreshing of how politics operates. But we've got an opportunity in the next Senedd elections. We've also got risks, by the way, but, you know, we've got a larger Senedd of 96 MSs. We've got a different electoral system, which is far from the system that my panel recommended, but nevertheless is a new system which is more proportional. But we've also got a terrain politically where the extremes will be represented. Now, that some people will say that's a good thing. You know, if the election takes place in the climate we're in currently, then we'll have Reform UK MSs, we'll have Green MSs, you know, we'll have Lib Dem, we'll have the usual main parties and so on. Now, that's either a good or bad thing, but if that's how the people vote, then generally it's a good thing, you know, because if people go out and support any party, they should have their representation in the Senedd. That will be a refresh. Very, very hard. Any party to win a majority in that system of PR. which means that the parties are going to have to think differently about liaising with each other, which of course has happened in Ireland and other countries in mainland Europe for a long, long time. So let's see. And by the way, you know, I read Fintan O'Toole's book on modern Ireland over the summer, and, you know, his take on what's happened in Ireland is very similar to our take on what's happened in Wales. You know, he's very, very critical of the political relationships and cronyism and, you know, all the rest of it. So let's not assume there's any state out there that is perfect, because I don't think there is. You know, there's problems with all of them.
Thank you. I think, yeah, at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Stephen England from the Art of Sustainability. Legislation without education is a blunt instrument. People comply, but they don't know why they're complying. And examples you've already mentioned about the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. In terms of your recommendations, what's your proposals or ideas on education and funding of that education so that more people can understand the conversation and get involved in the conversation?
Well, the only thing I'd say about that, because I think that took us beyond the remit of the report. You know, we weren't asked to try and operationalise how the recommendations could be put into force. But in the Welsh Government's response to our report, they do talk about some of the initiatives around information, education, training, awareness, all of those themes that are currently operating. But the way I understand it is that the group that is present within Welsh Government dealing with the constitutional matters has the issue of information and knowledge and awareness right at the top of their agenda, before we even get to the recommendations about, for example, an expert panel or an advisory panel on democratic innovation, or the principled approach to building a Welsh constitution that we recommended as well, or even the review of Senedd reform post-2026 elections, because I think there's a real understanding that without instigating real generational change about political knowledge, we're whistling in the wind here, aren't we, really? And you know, you're mentioning policies, but a lot of people don't even understand the opportunity to vote in a Senedd election. That's going to be complicated further, I guess, by the change in the electoral system, changing boundaries, of course, for 2026, because we have to create the 16 super constituencies. So we've got a lot of challenges, but maybe that's the perfect storm. You know, when all this is happening, this is the moment at which we reach out through schools, colleges, any institution, quite frankly, and be imaginative about how we get people to understand how their politics works. But as Rowan said earlier, it's got to be made relevant. You know, that was the other thing that people told us in our groups. If we speak in constitutional language or political language, you know, people will switch off straight away, except those of us who are naturally interested. We've got to make things relevant to everyday lives, because that's what people care about. You know, how does it affect their children's education and NHS waiting lists, and how does a tweak in the constitutional powers, you know, have some impact on that, really?
I mentioned that we'd done our best to contact groups of young people to talk about this, and we had some success with that, I think, especially through this extraordinary network called Democracy Box, which essentially creates what you might call pop-up seminar opportunities for young people. There'll be a drop-in centre where young people can come and talk about public issues with volunteers. And I visited one of these in Cardiff about 18 months ago. And what was fascinating was the sense of frustration among many of the young people about how little their educational culture really encouraged them to take a responsible approach. The culture of a lot of education institutions is, sadly, sausage machine based. You know, you get through the motions, you jump through the hoops. And they said, well, we wouldn't mind a little bit of breathing space where we could talk about the kind of country we'd like to live in. And one of the achievements of that group, which I was very struck by, you'll remember it, Laura, when we launched, we did it in the Democracy Box Centre that was going on there. They'd taken over a disused property, commercial property, and used it for this purpose. And all around the walls were the guide to the Constitution of Wales constitutional structure of Wales, prepared by the young people themselves. That is, this group had encouraged the youngsters to identify the questions that they and their contemporaries were asking, to fit them on to what the constitutional structure was, to create a learning tool in their own terms. Now, the point of that is not just that it creates an effective learning tool, but it's a learning experience. They've learned to work together. They've learned something about politics, in fact, just by having to work together and finding the questions that matter and how to link them up with structural issues. Now, I would love to see more of that going on because, as you say, legislation about curricula is a blunt instrument. Changing the culture requires changing the practice.
Thank you. I think we better go to an online question because of our online audience.
Thanks, Sarah. Plenty of questions coming through online. Frank Callis has a question. Frank, I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, certainly. Thank you for your presentation. You spoke about intergovernmental relations. I wonder if you considered whether the reform of local authorities, which are desperately in need of reform, whether that should precede any change to the constitutional settlement, and did that influence some of your thinking?
Well, it certainly featured, but like everything with a commission and, you know, for pretty broad terms of reference, it was almost impossible to cover everything we would have liked to have covered. But one of our principles for for approaching the work was subsidiarity. So we talked a lot about the kind of real meaning of subsidiarity, you know, and where there was a real value in devolving. Because actually, at times, there isn't a value in devolving. Let's be perfectly honest about this. You know, it's better to be objective and frank about how that works. And clearly, the governance of Wales at a local level is served so importantly by local authorities, really critical actors, I think, in the governance map of Wales. And for many people in Wales, the most important tier of government, because, you know, it's the one that touches their lives most radically, I guess. But it wasn't for us to recommend changes in that. So now I'm going to take off my commission hat and tell you what I really think, because we couldn't do this thing. I think it's absolutely imperative that we change local government, mainly because of the wastage and the structures which simply are not fit for a nation of the population size that Wales is, and which cost tremendous amounts of money without commensurate returns. But the political context for that is problematic, as we know. But political contexts change. You know, after the next Senedd election, it will be very hard for one party to be in power alone, as we said, so that there may be the opportunity then to reform this. But it requires a buy-in from local government as well. Let's not kid ourselves. If everybody's going to be dog in manger about this and say, you're not touching my structures, we're never going to have a map of governance that works for the Welsh people. You know, 22 local authorities is not working for the Welsh people. Neither, by the way, is the relationship between Welsh government and local government in Wales. That's not working either. So let's at least have the conversation about what we could do to change that. But in fairness, that's my view, not the view of the Commission, because we weren't able to look at that.
No, it wasn't really part of our remit as such. But I think a couple of general principles do emerge. One is the familiar nostrum that devolution doesn't stop at Cardiff. In other words, if subsidiarity is good for the UK, subsidiarity is good for Wales internally. And that means thinking about what is appropriately done by local government. Now, as Laura said, subsidiarity doesn't mean devolve everything. It means finding out what the effective structure is to solve this problem, this problem, this problem. And sadly, we have a kind of conflation. I agree very much with Laura. We've got a conflation of a suspicion of centralization with a suspicion of cooperation. In other words, pooling resources is not necessarily the same thing as centralizing resources. And pooling resources is quite clearly, I would say, imperative in an over-cumbersome, over-elaborate, and not always very effective system where, once again, you don't have the joining up that you need. So I would agree there's work to be done on this. There's probably another commission to be had on local government in Wales.
Thank you. A question from the floor? I was just looking for some female voices, but... Oh, there we go. Thank you. Sorry, gentlemen.
Thank you. I was wondering how you came to the conclusion in your report that it would be economically viable for an independent Wales?
Well, we don't actually say that, that is economically viable, because of course that depends on your take on economic viability, you know, which is a multiple complicated area. What we actually did was test each of the three constitutional models on the principles that we believed were important. So, sorry, I've repeated these: accountability, agency, equality, and subsidiarity. And we point out what the strengths and weaknesses are of each of those as applied to each of the three models. Now, you can argue the case for the economic viability of independence, okay? But there's a counter case for the problems economically of independence. But, and this is a big but, the same can be said for the devolution model at the moment. You know, a model that operates by a Barnett formula that is fundamentally unfair to Wales based on need is also not economically viable. So I hope you kind of follow in the point. We were trying to be honest brokers and objective about the principles that we were applying to each of those models. Anything is economically viable if you're prepared to take a hit for a period of time. I mean, I work a lot in Central Europe at the moment. And, you know, I mean, in the last month, I've been to Slovenia, Slovakia, Montenegro, Albania, other countries that I can't think of now. Each of those countries had to move to an independent economy fairly rapidly. For some of them, it was easier than others. Some of them had a difficult economic hit for a period of time. For others, and Slovenia is a good case in point, it was relatively smooth. So, you know, this isn't something, again, this isn't something exceptional to Wales. If Wales were to become independent, there would be economic disadvantages, but there would be economic potential, and those would be potential advantages as well. And that's what we say in the report, really, for each of the models, because beyond that, it's up to people to decide whether they feel that is a risk and an opportunity they want to take.
One of the things which we were able to do was to encourage Plaid Cymru to do some more sort of heavy lifting on their own economic thinking. So there's a couple of papers which we reference in the report, arguing controversially, but not trivially, arguing that the fiscal problems of an independent Wales are not as serious as generally been thought. Now, that caused a great deal of debate, is still causing debate. But the point is, it's there as a bit of research which prompts the discussion. And as Laura has said, we were not saying, oh, we think there's no problem about an independent Wales being financially viable. We were saying we would have to ask, was it worth facing a period of deep financial disruption and uncertainty in the hope that the final situation might solve some problems? And that's a question that only the Welsh people can answer.
Thank you. One more question online, I think.
Okay, it's a quick question, hopefully from Alan Davis. Alan, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Good morning to you both, and thank you for your efforts. It strikes me that to move this debate forward, we have to hope that people are engaged in the conversation. But I fear that the recent changes to our electoral system will have alienated people, as we've broken that very close relationship we have with our MP or our AM. The list system does not support that, and people may choose to be disengaged. Is the way the change was introduced wise in itself?
Well, this isn't part of the commission, but my views on this are in the public domain. I think it's the wrong system to use. It runs counter to a lot of the analysis that's been done on effective electoral systems, where the relationship between an elected member and a constituent remains an important one in our system. But more importantly for me, because you're referring to the closed list PR system that will come in 2026, is that it gives too much power to the political parties to choose the candidates that they want. And I'm sorry, I don't trust political parties to choose challenging candidates who are bright and thoughtful and difficult to handle, because, you know, any party whip will tell you that's not the type of person they want in a parliament necessarily. So I think the danger for each of the parties, but let's give them an opportunity, because they haven't selected their candidates yet. So let's give them the opportunity. But my views on this are clear. they should be looking not to reward longevity and loyalty to the party. They should be looking to bring in diverse candidates, not just representationally diverse, although that's really important, but cognitively diverse, people who come from different backgrounds and experiences and all the rest of it, who will be sparky contributors to the Senate's life. And let's be fair, that hasn't happened up until now. And when there have been sparky contributors to Senate life, they've been pushed away pretty quickly. I don't think the closed list is going to help in that regard. And I think you're right, Alan, you know, that this is a real risk to how our democracy operates. The only good thing I can say is that we did recommend a complete review on much more robust grounds than the original plans post 2026 and from a citizen's perspective. So if we feel, or if citizens tell us that they felt disenfranchised, they felt there's no motivation to vote because of the system, then that will be captured by the review in post-26 election. Doesn't help much, I know, but it's better than nothing in this model.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't very much we could say about this as a commission because it came while we were working. It wasn't strictly within our remit, but what we did, as Laura said, was to say, we welcome the commitment to a full and proper review by a Senate committee of the first election to operate under the new system. In other words, let the reader understand. We were, I think, giving as much as we could there to say, look, this will need looking at pretty hard because it's not quite where we're steering.
One final question, a quick one. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
I find it fascinating that a lot of the debate on devolution here in Wales is now quite robust. I feel like there is, as you've said, with this commission, more engagement, but a point that you kept referring to and that has been perennial throughout the whole history of devolution is the fact that a lot of the powers that are needed are from the UK government. The Brown report came out in 22, but it's been quite quickly, it seems in some areas, dismissed by the Labour Party. Although, weirdly, there's also a push now for devolution to the north, internally within England. To what extent do you think a similar commission or starting a similar debate with citizens in England is key to pushing forward the debate on how the structure of the UK works in general, and then leading to actually being able to argue the case to the UK government level?
That's such an interesting question. I think when we started our work, we were conscious of wanting to make this part of a UK-wide conversation, ideally. The Brown report, I think, was looking in the right direction in several ways, though in detail there might be any number of tangles to sort out. But you're quite right. I think the Brown report has almost sunk without trace in the Labour Party. The Labour Party has been so fixated on getting into government with an absolutely rigorous financial and fiscal program, and you know that's it. So that any larger questions about governance have just been off the radar in public discussion. I'd like to think, and like Laura, I'm not holding my breath, I'd like to think that maybe when the dust has settled a bit, that sort of conversation might open up, especially as the regional question is on the radar now, and people like Andy Burnham make sure that it stays on the radar, and I'm very grateful for the fact that he's there doing that. So that's probably where it'll come alive, and I would hope to see that as something which a UK government slightly more settled in its skin in a year or so might want to pursue, if only because part of the sort of protracted political train crash of the last 5 years or so has had to do with a sense of alienation, whether that's expressed in terms of just detachment from the whole process, the popularity of reform, the rise generally of populism. You know, if we've seen a series of disastrous public events and disastrous leadership, well, maybe when, as I say, the government has settled into its skin a bit more, maybe it's time to raise the question, what kind of political culture delivers us from the risk of that level of dysfunctionality? And I hope that'll be the needle that pushes things.
I think Rowan's right. And, let's give the benefit of the doubt to the new UK government, you know, so at very early days. But it can be dangerous having such a big majority as well, as we're starting to see now, you know, with disgruntled backbenchers who haven't got a clear role and scope to get bored easily and attack and so on. I think this is a real test for Welsh Labour as well, actually, because, you know, cohabitation is one thing, but it's not as easy to be in power at UK and Welsh level as some people believe, you know, because what has served Welsh Labour well has been its distinctiveness, the fact that it's Welsh oriented, the fact that it's, you know, parked its tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawn very effectively, so not created much space for Plaid to operate. The minute that recedes, the risks appear for Welsh Labour. And the conference was really interesting. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but the conference was really interesting because, you know, allowing the UK government to legislate for Welsh government in certain areas is risky. It's massively risky because what people will ask is what's the point of Welsh government, and what's the point of devolution, and what's the point of Welsh Labour? So, you know, be careful what you wish for is my kind of advice to Welsh Labour, because if Eluned Morgan now can't carve out or reinvent the identity that has been so powerful, you know, it's so successful. Welsh Labour is the most successful political party pretty much anywhere in the Western world in terms of winning elections, but that won't happen forever, you know, unless it retains the identity that it has now in the public's mind. So I think it's interesting times, and the debate on England feeds into that, really, in power dynamics as well.
Thank you so much. We always try and make sure our breakfast briefing's close to time, but I'm sure there's still a coffee and tea and a couple of croissants left if you want to hang around for a little chat. Thank you so much both. Honestly, lovely sparky contributions from the pair of you, which we really, really value and appreciate. Brilliant summary of all of your really fantastic hard work and some real indicators about where it could possibly go as well. Thanks also for our Vice-Chancellor joining us today. That is the importance of the topic. Professor Wendy Lana, our new Dean, Professor Tim Edwards over there, and our former Dean, Professor Rachel Ashworth. So such an important topic, and thank you all so much for joining us today. There'll be a recording that's made available to you, and I'm sure there's questions in the chat, and if people have follow-up questions, let us know and we can try and get those answered for you. So thanks so much everyone, and hope to see you again at another event soon.